This is John Drabinsky, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Jared Ball, who teaches in the Department of Africana Studies at Morgan State University. He is the author of a number of scholarly and public-facing essays, as well as the book The Myth and Propaganda of Black Buying Power from 2023. He also hosts the series I Mix What I Like, which conducts critical conversations on key issues in African American and African diasporic life. In this podcasted discussion, we explore the politics of Black studies, the past and future of the study of Black life, and what kinds of commitments hold the best promise for the future of the field. Jared, hello. How are you today?
I'm great. Better than most. How are you? It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm not bad. I'm actually really excited that we found this time to talk. I really love your work. We'll get into talking about it. I think there's so much about the field of Black studies and some of the imperatives of Black studies that you really practice well around being a public intellectual, but also being very rigorous in that public intellectual front, as well as teaching and writing. So I'm really looking forward to getting into it today and hearing your thoughts. And also, I'll just add, since you are a professional in this medium, really appreciate that we will have top-notch sound on this podcast.
No, it's an honor. I appreciate it. And I become a little bit of I guess, an audiophile of sorts doing this work. But no.
I do love those moments when it's like coming straight from the Black Studies studio. So
right.
Got a little bit of that sound today. So, we'll get into the, how you imagine the field of Black studies, how you think about your own work in relation to it and all of that. But I wanted to start really with a more personal question and just ask you to narrate for us a bit, what drew you to Black studies? What drew you to the study of Black life? And what sustains you in relation to both of those?
So, one of the things that I always point to is something I heard. Part of it is that I had a little bit of a relatively unorthodox upbringing, somewhat of a politicized upbringing, and then on the sort of the racial boundary, being the son of a radically politicized European Jew and a similarly radically politicized Black man from the Black liberation movement. In fact, technically, I'm a SNCC baby since my father was a co-founder of the Cincinnati chapter of SNCC. But so there's, and I grew up with a lot of mythology, not a lot of direct experience through that, but a lot of mythology around what both of them were and had done and what they thought. So I was sort of always encouraged to some sort of politicized life. But what it really was what I think it was is I was trying to figure things out post what I describe as a sentence in the U.S. Navy, was hearing in a lecture tape a presentation from the late Runoko Rashidi, where he was talking about the African contributions to world civilization, but he told a story that was essentially about his point being that many of us as Black men enter the academy generally in a search for our missing fathers. And I admit, when I heard that, it had a very overtly conscious impact on what I thought I wanted to do and what path I wanted to pursue and why. It sort of like was a revealing statement. It revealed my own unconscious to me in a way. In specifically being in wanting to answer questions that had been up to that point unanswered as to very personal things about my life and background and family. I entered the academy really, and then seeking those answers, and specifically being introduced through what for many of us is an introduction to Malcolm X and sort of radical blackness that way to the history of Black or Africana studies. And it was at first a very conscious and very, I think, selfish or personal, maybe self-centered. I don't know, maybe it's selfish is too strong, but sort of a selfish attempt to answer questions about my own life that turned into a broader interest in wanting to answer the questions around Blackness, Africanity, et cetera, more broadly. But that was, so I came into the academy as a and into Black studies from that, and then from also the perspective of grassroots political organizing, which I had engaged prior to even getting into the academy. Again, joining late after that military sentence. But so that was it. So my approach, again, was politicized. It was relatively radical, and it was wanting to uncover and unearth questions about what was being done to Black people, and then what had Black people done, been contributing to world civilization. And then ultimately, as John Henrik Clarke heard from Arturo Schomburg, wanting to as I think it was said, to study the missing pages of world history. And that's what Black studies had become for me, and then I think for many others, with that. And then lastly, with that intent that it be the parallel to a politicized, organized political struggle, movement, broader movements. So, yeah, no, this is interesting to hear you tell that, both as having, you said a SNCC baby, which is a really interesting phrase. I really love that, and this mythology that came with it. But also that led you to the question of missing pages, right? It wasn't already filled pages, but sort of birthed a set of questions in you, that sense of the interrogative, rather than, I think if one was to anticipate the early part of that story, it would be that you came with a sort of set of propositions or set of understandings. It's really interesting that it led you to a set of questions. I really love that. Yeah, no, I was, again, wasn't bringing much to it at all. In fact, I owe almost everything intellectually that I have to Africana or Black studies, because I was coming to it. And I do like to add the story, part of it was that while I was delivering pizza, I would get these lecture tapes from Everyone's Place, which is, I still think, the best Black bookstore I've ever been in Baltimore, which is in Baltimore on North Avenue. And I used to go out there, get these lecture tapes, and some other contraband, if we're being perfectly honest. And then I would come back to deliver my pizzas and create this, my story is between those lecture tapes and rap music mixtapes. I was attempting to create a new media environment in the car while I was delivering pizzas. So as I'm listening to these lecture tapes, again, initially unconsciously just wanting information, and but when I heard that Runoko Rashidi line, I said, no, that's what you're really doing. You're trying to find out what happened with you and your father, what happened to his people, to your people, what's going on, and that's where you should go to find the answers. And that did lead me into and then I once I of course, realize that this is more important than my own personal experience and solutions. It became sort of natural and logical that I would stay somewhat within the field in some associated fashion. Yeah.
Yeah, I think about so many of my teaching experiences, the students coming in and taking that time to discover that what they're learning in Black studies is opening up all these different kinds of questions. I mean, I don't know what your experience has been. I mean, it's hard to generalize because there's so many different kinds, of course, for each of us, each semester, student by student even. But one of the things I really love about Black studies is that moment where students come in with thinking that they have the sort of there to add richness to what they already know. And to be introduced to all these other kinds of questions, it could be jolting, but that's you're supposed to have that. That's what a classroom is supposed to do. But it's jolting in the best sense, as you said. It's like going beyond the personal narrative, but also that being, that personal narrative, as you talked about it, being animated by this mythology. That's going to stick with me for a while. I love that, bequeathing to your children a mythology that they then explore. I mean, that's what mythologies are supposed to be, right? They're supposed to send us on journeys that are guided and have some roots and have some deep values.
In their positive sense, for sure. There's, of course, a negative spin that can be put on that. But I think I like how you put that, and that's sort of, that's, and again, I mean, part of it though, not to, again, extend the autobiography here, but the point you're making about how students come to the classroom, I think is a good one. I think that it is important for me to, I think it is important for me to point out that by the time I got there, I had already, not that it can't happen and doesn't happen for people earlier, but I had gone through a particularly humbling experience of quickly being, this quick succession of events of going from graduating from high school, being kicked out of my house, being arrested, and ending up in boot camp by the end of the summer, and then going through 4 years in the Navy. A couple of low-level engagements with military conflict and war, and then sort of being spit out or running out, I should say, into the labor force, the low-level, again, pizza delivering labor force. So I had been humbled enough to, at least if I was being honest with myself, to say, look, whatever you thought you knew about the world, you have a lot to learn. You got a lot of questions that need answering. You're clearly not getting them on your own, and you're not doing this right. So yeah. So I in some sense, I think that's important. And I think sometimes I certainly get students who still have the ego of youth, and sometimes the understandable but misplaced arrogance that comes with not knowing really yet how the world works and what their place is in it, before they can be humbled enough to say, okay, I'm here, I can actually learn some things. And yeah.
I mean, I always prefer to pull students down than push them up. So I like the I know everything, and then we expand from there.
Right on.
And many students go the opposite direction. That's a rough one. But I also just want to underscore, as somebody like you loves books, the idea that a bookstore factors in so centrally is just a beautiful and wonderful thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let me ask you about your thoughts on the field of Black Studies, how you imagine the field. And I ask this question always from its origin point, which really had a tension built into it at its foundation. There was the demand for the study of the Black intellectual tradition, that disciplines on university campuses had not done this work. And so Black Studies was going to be this place where people could teach, research, and learn in the classroom about the richness of African American and diasporic African traditions. But of course, at that exact same time, in the late 1960s, early 1970s, Black liberation struggle had radicalized and really started to demand a very different relationship between everything from study to action, from classroom to community, from campus to neighborhood. All of these lines get blurred, and Black Studies is also rooted in that struggle, that demand for prescriptive action, right, for intervention for Black liberation. So there is that sort of moment of the intellectual tradition and that moment of liberation struggle where they have a relationship, but they also have a tension built into it, into that relationship. But that was 50-something years ago. And so I'm always interested in this podcast to hear how people think about the field now in 2025 while we're recording this, 56 years later. Because in some ways we live in a very different world, but in some ways we still ask these same questions as Black Studies scholars, as teachers, as people in the world. So, how do you imagine the field of Black studies, especially framed by this origin story?
Well, I mean, I see it as I said a moment ago, what it should be, the intellectual arm of a liberation struggle, liberation movement or movements. But what precipitated, as you were outlining, the evolution of Black studies were those movements. Those movements have been suppressed, obliterated, disbanded, and are currently not organized in any similar and potent fashion with that similar demand, which in this case was for an accurate education and teaching of, in this case, Black and African world histories and ideas for the specific purpose of improving the conditions of those communities. So when that gets cut off, and I remember the late, great Dr. James Turner, who was the founding director of the Africana Studies and Research Center at Cornell, where I had the privilege of spending a few years. As he used to point out to us in the classroom, he talked about he would put it in terms of the inside and outside game, that basketball analogy, that without the outside game, those on the inside are doomed. So, and then, and for those on the inside, if they lose sight of the outside game and think it's all about them on the inside, they're again similarly doomed. And those on the outside of them then themselves doomed by the fact that they have no inside support that they thought that they were getting by creating that situation in the first place. So if the movement in the broader world has been suppressed, then the idea that Black studies and those within the field, within these institutions, are going to be able to carry out some broadly radical mission, especially over 50 plus years, is at best naive. And so I see the field as, I think, as I heard you putting it, struggling with that contradiction and that initial inherent conflict of wanting to create, institutions within institutions that are themselves hostile to those people in those communities. So the way I think it's happened, and I have to say, I do think the Africana Studies and Research Center is a microcosmic example of this, that something that is forcibly brought onto the campus and imposed on the campus by outside struggle involving, in some cases, militancy and arms. Over time, the dominant institutions can play a long game, and even in some cases wait out the retirement and unfortunately the death of some of the founding members, and even immaterially the founding ideas. And then through funding or the lack thereof, through targeted hiring or the lack thereof, you end up with a situation where the Africana Studies and Research Center loses its autonomy, is subsumed back within the College of Liberal Arts with a very different political mission. Yeah. So it would be easy for me and others to say, well, this is all the fault of those on the inside. This is all the fault of those who took those jobs and those positions and did or didn't do this or that. But part of the point I was starting with is that without the outside game of broader movements and political struggles demanding of the Africana Studies and Research Center a certain politics and behavior, it's not fair to expect that those on the inside could, even if they wanted to, withstand that fight over certainly this long a period of time. So that's what I think is ultimately where we are. And what I encourage when asked is that people become parts of political organizations, grassroots, in communities, and become part of a demand that gets placed back on institutions like universities and then the programs within them, or the departments or schools or whatever within them, to demand a certain outcome, which would then be a protective measure for those on the inside performing the work, again, in this case, in Black studies. So, but without that, no matter how good we might think we are, the best of us are not going to be capable of withstanding the pressures that are still going to continue to come from the dominant institution in society.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, thank you for that. That is extremely thoughtful, but also beyond being thoughtful is a reminder about originating imperatives and imperatives that, like, I mean, I was thinking as you were talking, I've had similar conversations recently on this podcast where, there is a real question in this moment where, when we're recording this, by the time it's out, it will be over. But we're just days away from a far right government coming into power without any sense of there being a check, a block, a limit on what they might do. And so thinking about our field, it's like, who are our allies? Where are our numbers? And so what you're talking about there, about those relationships that go beyond, is the dean, is sociology, is history, is English, comfortable with us, on our side, protective of us, right? Those are small numbers, if they are even numbers. But one of the things that keeps coming up in these podcasts that you just put so well is, what does it mean that that's where we're looking for our numbers in a time of, I want to say potential, but I think that's too optimistic, in a time of very real existential crisis for the field?
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned other fields in the humanities. Where, from my vantage point, the threat is all the focus and the emphasis on STEM.
Oh God, yeah.
And obviously no disrespect to the fields themselves or the ideas or the work within those fields, but it's the politicized use of them, as I understand it, to discourage any, particularly Black, but among many others, involvement in what might lead to critical thinking in liberal arts. And then, so before we even get to the already more established and protected English, sociology, et cetera, I think we have to contend with that reality, particularly at a HBCU like Morgan State, where it is, there's Black studies, and we'll get to this, which barely exists and has barely existed there, is trying to emerge 56 years late in an environment where philosophy and psychology and sociology, what are thought to be sort of these mainstays, history had to, in Morgan, history is now history and geography and religious studies, I believe, is the full something like that. So history isn't even a standalone department anymore. So anyway, so that's what the entire, all of this collapse is, and then of course, what is the encouraged response for faculty, certainly administration, is always a rightward conservative trajectory, to save themselves, to save fields and funding and space, et cetera. So when you mention, the incoming, president administration and what that means for, it's now I will say, and I know we don't have, this is much on the side here, but I do think there's a parallel between what I was trying to just say there about how we should respond to attempts to suppress critical thinking within university spaces, and of course, as that would trickle down and negatively impact Black studies. But I think there is a parallel to how we should understand this incoming presidency and administration. That is, that as some new reports are coming out and showing just now over the last few days, to sort of support what I and some of my colleagues have been arguing all along, is that Kamala Harris lost not because the country got more conservative and more racist than it had been previously, but because specifically she didn't want to break to the left from Biden, specifically around Palestine and the genocide there, but more broadly. In other words, my point being that the argument I would put forth as a method of saving Black studies and any other potentially critically thinking producing field would be to move to the left, to become more aggressive in advocating for a leftward move, as opposed to trying to become more conservative to fit within the ever rightward reactionary leanings of a corporate and military environment that funds and influences universities and encourages, so that would be, and I hope that made sense. I was trying to just quickly put that parallel together, sense. But that's what I would want to advocate, that we save Black studies by becoming more aggressive in a leftward, trajectory and advocacy around what Black studies is and has been, or should be and has been.
Look, the way the worst among us end up setting the standard, right? Setting the center, setting the measure, and all of that. I mean, it's as old as global empire, but there's also a whole tradition of taking, oneself or one's group as its own standard. Like, what is our standard? What do we want? Rather than how can we accommodate? Because once you start accommodating rightward drift, that makes you a rightward. Just, that's what drift means. You go along with it. So.
Right.
Well, let me shift to your work and ask you a little bit, talk a little bit about your work. Your work is this interesting mix of political theory engaged with social questions, historical, political questions, and you're also deeply engaged with public knowledge and mobilization, right? As not just questions and ideas, but also in your own intellectual production. So I'm interested in how you think the kind of work that you do fits with the history of Black studies, and also what new horizons do you think it's opening up for the field?
Oh, wow. I don't know about if my work is opening up new horizons. I don't think I wouldn't even begin to argue or think that I've done anything to make that much of an impact. What I think
you host public disputes over some of the most important ideas in the field for free. Like,
okay,
people could all watch that. That's innovative. I just gotta say.
Okay. No, I see. Okay, I see what you're saying. Well, in part. Okay, I see what you're saying, but part of what, and maybe this will help explain part of what I've always thought I was doing was playing I used to describe myself as being, sometimes I'll say to students, think of me as someone who is in the league, that is in the NBA or in the NFL, but is more of a role player, or I'm coming off the bench. Now, that doesn't mean, I'm not a superstar. I'm not, an all-star. I'm not someone whose poster is going to be on your wall. But that also might mean if you see me in the street, I'm still nice, but I'm not. Is what I'm saying. So I'm trying to be, but at the same time. So, honestly, what I've been trying to do is, I made a note when preparing for this discussion that I've always quietly likened myself, or wanted to live up to, what I saw as a tradition being laid down by the late Listervelt Middleton. And I don't even know if you or others are familiar with him, but he was someone who came he was a brother, a poet, and a sort of an autodidact lay student of African world who hosted a program called For the People on South Carolina public access television. And for a time in the 80s...
I'm sorry if I can interrupt you really quickly.
Sure.
I think that series has come up twice previously in this podcast.
I wouldn't be surprised, because for a certain generation of us, Listervelt Middleton was the man. And again, when I would go to Everyone's Place and get lecture tapes, or a lot of them were audio recordings of his interviews. And he would interview all of the pretty much all of the mostly African-centered, Afrocentric, scholars of the day. And he had at one point, it seemed like, talked to all of them. And again, I started as a pizza delivery guy listening to this. So what I endeavored to do was to sort of, I wanted to learn enough to do that kind of work competently. And then, the professionalization of that had as much to do with coming to terms with the fact that I'm going to need to earn a living. I've already experienced the kind of work I don't want to do. And the academic world, while imperfect, is pretty good relative to the rest of the labor force that I would have access to, at least. So I was like, this is pretty good. I can, study what I want to study, and then I can find ways to contribute in the way, if this guy can get on South Carolina public access TV and produce all this incredible work, maybe I can find a way to contribute in a similar way. And I got into broadcasting and mixtape making, and then ultimately YouTube through that. So that was what I wanted to do, and to try to carry on that tradition in new media. In fact, even iMWiL, which is the title of my first book and is sort of my brand, so to speak, everywhere, is an honorific to Steve Biko, who used to write as I Write What I Like. And I was just wanting to live up to that kind of tradition of media making in the modern era. So I was involved with mixtapes and hip hop and radio. So I said I mix what I like as opposed to I write what I like, but it was meant to reflect a Black studies, activist, media, journalistic ethic as much as it was, a reference to DJing. So anyway, that's how so I don't mean to suggest that I've done nothing or I've not made a contribution. I just am trying to clarify, there are people who have truly shaped the field, redefined the field, and I would never put myself at that level. But where I've tried to find a way to contribute is again, I can read their work, I can study their work, I can teach their work in the classroom, and then find ways to communicate it elsewhere as well, to find people like me, people who are not lined up to go to the academy and who will find themselves maybe delivering pizza and they need something to listen to. Yeah. Why not? And so that's how I
No, I love that. I mean, because I was thinking when I was, thinking about our conversation today, that's in some ways a new horizon. That's why I said, no, this is this is an important new thing. But hearing you talk, and I'd already kind of thought this, but hearing you talk really clarified it for me, which is that thing that you do with I Mix What I Like, as a body of work is, I think, immensely innovative and important for Black studies, but also thinking about it in relation to the past of Black studies is, for me, and as you just said, this moment for us to reflect on where do we actually draw that boundary of this thing we call Black studies, right? Because it is like an academic field, but what Black studies is, where it happens, is so diffuse. This again has come up across a lot of these podcasts. I'm thinking about Jay Carter from very early on podcasts where he said, in some ways the first Black studies that he was aware of and was engaged with was the church reading group, right? Where they read and talked about ideas of justice and goodness and political mobilization and action, and these radio or public access television series or mixtapes, in these ways that's where we draw the boundary of Black studies says a lot about that, like where do you fit in the tradition and what new horizons do you open up? Because I think what you do does open up a new horizon inside the academic field. But as you just said, inside the wider field of what Black studies actually is beyond its institutionalization at universities, you're a continuation of a lot of really important things. And I also just not to go on too long, but I really love that idea that you need something to listen to when you're doing that Uber driver delivery. And why not that instead of, a talk show, just blabbering about, gossip and celebrities? What about something that, is talking to, whoever, right? Poet, activist, writer. I love that.
Yeah, I mean, if anybody has ever spent a lot of time in a vehicle doing work, even today where you have a lot of, satellite radio and whatever, the options that would lead to the level of depth and radical thought that you would get in sort of Black studies discussions is not going to be there. I mean, it's just more options that are being presented from the already monopolized and consolidated, media environment and ownership, et cetera. So, so I mean, it does and as my godfather says, of his own former radio work, the goal for him of his previous generation was to give Black people something to say at the water cooler. So when you show up at work, the idea when you had to go to the water cooler, I don't know if that exists anymore in workspaces, but your colleagues might say something wild and that they picked up from Fox News or MSNBC or CNN. And if that's all you've been listening to, you might not have the appropriate response. So you have to have a different media environment producing something different, so yeah, that was always, I mean, that was really what I wanted to do. And then to find ways I had hoped in terms of political activism to be more impactful in changing the world. I never thought of myself as being capable of changing the world through scholarship or anything like that. So,
yeah. So, I mean, I love that take that your godfather had. I love the
and Tom Porter is his name. Let me just say his name, Tom Porter, another co-founder of the SNCC chapter in Cincinnati.
Okay,
longtime broadcaster in DC, and
I was going to say this is no random person. Okay, that's your godfather. Yeah. Excellent. Good to have his name on this. So, I mean, it tells a lot probably then about, how you got into your doctoral work in journalism and public communications. And so I'm interested to hear you talk a little bit about your thinking and your teaching both, and how that's been impacted by, doing a doctorate in journalism and now working in Africana studies, because these aren't traditional disciplines of, say, English history, sociology that I think really feed Black studies, right? But they're also, journalism is also, as you've talked about, this other side of the study of Black life, and it's spread through conversation and critique and debate. But I'm curious how that particular trajectory that you had, the Africana work with James Turner at Cornell, and then your journalism PhD work, how you think that's impacted both how you think, but also how you construct and practice in the classroom.
So, I'll start the latter part. I openly admit to trying and failing, but trying to set a classroom experience similar to the ones I had with Dr. Turner, which was, I'm just not as smart or cool or skilled in the classroom as he was. But the goal is give assignments, reading, watching, listening, and then invite discussion. And through discussion, some debate, some critical thinking, hopefully expand people's radical critical thinking capability over 15, 16 weeks. Mm-hmm. And then I will often tell them, I do want you to become a revolutionary by the end of this process, and that I am attempting to propagandize you. And the fact that I'm telling you is me being honest and open and giving you a chance to defend yourself. But that is a goal so I do encourage that students be aware that this is happening, that is my goal. And just to be fair to them, they don't have to get an A, but that is the goal. Because as you know, the way it happened for me is that going from, why I went into academia in the first place, or why I wanted to pursue advanced degrees in the first place, was specifically to answer those questions, as I said earlier, and to find out, with some radical criticism involved, why things were happening in the world and to me. And in that process, it became pretty clear that if you engage it through the experience of the African world and its interaction with Europe and Europeans throughout the last 500-600 years, it has been, as Jeanette Dates and the late William Barlow used to say, in terms of the engagement and what media are, is a battle of ideas. It's been a conflict. It's been hostile. Du Bois even referred to the propaganda of history as it relates to what has been done to Black people. So to me, it became a perfect overlap. The study specifically of the African world, followed up by a specific study and focus on the construct of the U.S. media environment and its very political and militarized, intelligence agency-driven history. It's very colonial purpose, more specifically. So that's how I engage the classroom in those two subject areas, to say that there is a political context and purpose behind why the African world and beyond has been constructed as it has been, and why there's been a need for the evolution of a Black studies, and why our media environment, at least in the United States, has taken the shape as it has. And that's what I want us to investigate and discuss and challenge. And then I do borrow from another former professor who we actually had a very negative experience when I was an undergrad as a student. But I always take something from what he said, that he always said we have to interrogate our preferences. And I do say all the time to my students that we have to ask ourselves, how do we know what we know, and why do we like what we like? And that's a very political social construct, more so than most people think. So that's at least what I, and how I approach it. And then in the classroom, I just try to have some fun but engage through discussion mostly, if that answers your question.
Yeah. I mean,
not, yeah.
It's a question about, how does Black studies inform the classroom? And I like that, if I've been effective in this conversation as a professor, you will leave here committed to liberation struggle. I mean,
yeah. So, and in fact, I will say, mostly what I teach now are introductory courses to Black studies, and I say this is an introduction to, another way of putting it is an introduction into a variety of radical ideas and theories and approaches to freeing Black people, and that's what that is always a central focus of my course. And courses, really doesn't matter what I'm teaching, but that would be as it relates specifically to Black studies, what I do try to convey and what I want students to take away from, that at least they've been introduced to, okay, this is supposed to be a field for liberation. We're not free. All the initial questions that Black studies has set out to answer. In fact, I've been using Abdul Al-Kalimat's Intro to Black Studies, his more recently published one. And as he sets off a series of questions that Black studies has been asked to address, they all still are relevant, and we still haven't figured out which one's going to get us where. Yeah. So whether you have tendencies towards materialism, and I admit my biases around that, whether you have tendencies towards various forms of nationalisms, cultural and otherwise, we have something for you there too. And at the end of the day, I don't care where you would find yourself, as long as you get in there and get busy. So that's anyway. Yeah.
I really love the question, that we have to know, why we like what we like. students are so good at diagnosing other people, but when you turn that around on them, that's an uncomfortable conversation, and they don't like it. But young people. I was a young person many years ago, sadly, but I was a young person once, and we love doing that to other people. But when it's done to us, it's a tough question. But it's the existential question, and it's such an important existential question in moments of thinking about liberation.
Like I said, I had to go through basically a 6-year process of humiliation before I was ready to even sit down and start to take any of this stuff seriously. And again, so I try to remember that when 18 and 19-year-olds show up in my classroom feeling like I'm just here to get an A. I don't really have much that you can teach me. There's not really much that I need to learn. But since I have to spend 16 weeks here, I'll just hang out. And, they haven't, I try to remind myself that they haven't yet maybe had that humbling experience. By the way, when we first showed up, I mean, Dr. Turner, I do often like to share the story. The first thing Dr. Turner did with my grad school cohort, because he could see the arrogance. Ward Churchill, I think I get this from him. He said, you go to undergrad, you think you know everything, and you go to grad school to find out you know nothing, and then you get a PhD where you realize nobody knows anything. And that for me has been the process. So when I showed up to grad school, I was arrogant. I said, I've already been in the military. I took undergrad seriously. I feel like I'm caught up with the reading. I'm here to help you. You know what I mean? Like, I'm here to do you a favor. Mm-hmm. And in one meeting, he just asked us a series of questions about some key names, some ideas, some histories. He could see, he used at the time, the chalkboard to illuminate for us what we were not aware of and how empty our answers were. And by the end of that process, I literally remember walking out of that one meeting completely intellectually humbled and at least willing to say to myself, you got to be more serious. You were not ready. And, but I was by that point, again, much older than the students that show up in my classroom. And so I try to, but I do think, and I do tell them, I want my class to be an interruptive moment for you. Mm-hmm. You have to have a version of that happen if we're going to get anywhere. So.
I mean, I just got done this past semester teaching a seminar, which I've taught a bunch of times, just on Angela Davis. I really like single-figure seminars. And every time a student says some version, a group of, many students, if not all of them, say some version of this, which I loved how blunt this student was, about halfway through the semester, came up afterwards, and I enrolled in this class because I thought Davis was cool. But this shit is really hard. And I was like, there we go. It's always that experience. So it goes to that question of humility in a really productive sense.
Yeah.
Because I'm not interested. I don't hear it in you at all either. I'm not interested in students feeling dumb or bad or ignorant. But I am interested in that moment of like, well, you may not be the first to think things out here suck and we really need to do something about it. But also that some of your heroes were very serious people. And just because they look cool in a photograph doesn't mean they're easy to read. But that's the puzzle. That's the fun. I love that part. Yeah.
And it doesn't mean you understand them.
Oh yeah.
It doesn't mean you understand the image that you've seen or yeah. So I think
we start early with that on Angela Davis essay, Afro Images, where she's like, everybody knows me from the Afro and how that was so iconic, but they forget that was linked to anti-imperial Black power politics. And then the students are like, oh, I kind of feel caught in that 1982 or whatever it is essay. But that's a productive place of getting caught. I always try to remind them of that. This is ultimately, if you want to be on the same team as Angela Davis, the hard reading is part of the game. So,
yeah, absolutely. And then if you, I mean, I do also have to say that if you want to be to the left of where Angela Davis is now, it helps to have a better understanding of not only her life and history and her politics, but also to that point of what her image has become. And yeah, so yeah. And I'm kind of also stuck on this. I would love to develop, I haven't thought of it that way, to develop a course around a single individual. For some reason that hasn't dawned on me, but I think that could be very interesting.
I mean, students get to see how new curiosities come up over decades of writing, and and people develop. I mean, somebody like Davis is really interesting that way. James Baldwin as well. They encounter, the world changes. They try to figure it out. I mean, I will say, reading Angela Davis beginning to the present, you really see somebody who's had her finger on the pulse of emerging crises. That she's somebody who has actually shifted her work quite a bit over the years. And as students seeing that, that I think every young person, I mean, if they're any bit like me, they think their issues are the eternal issues, but then they're like, no, these things emerge at a certain point, and maybe in the future there will be unexpected emerging things for them as well. But
yeah.
Well, let me ask you a couple of concluding questions about the field of Black Studies, and start with this one, which is, what over the past 5.5 decades, what do you think Black Studies has done well, and what do you think it has not done particularly well?
So I had written a note to myself for trying a way to try to answer a question like this, because I'm really conflicted. So what I wrote here is Black Studies has done well to survive, and in so doing, has not been able to maintain an appropriate politics. But it could not, given the suppression of movements around the world, which is sort of the point I was making earlier. So that is for me the contradiction, that Black Studies has done well to survive, and in some ways to evolve. I mean, now we were reviewing a couple articles on this last semester around, is it Black or Africana or Africology, African world? What are we naming it? And some of the debates around that or discussions around that are interesting in terms of how the conversations being sort of around an evolution, that, we have everything from programs to autonomous institutions, schools, within universities. But at the same time, there is still also a lot of work produced under the name of Black Studies that at least I would consider to be far too liberal, far too centrist, far too reactionary, and not part of that initial mission, as I've always understood it to be, to liberate, to add to the canon of radical theory, critical history, and advocacy, political advocacy. So, and by that, and I know it's, for me, just, it's an overly simplified way of putting it, but that I think Black Studies should be more overtly left of the Democratic Party, just as a, sort of a standard, sort of an easy line to draw. And I know there's a lot of complicated and nuance from that point forward, and to the extent it's not, and to the extent it has become too easily a part of the promotion of empire, to championing, Kwame Ture, I quote this all the time, famously said, Black power is not Black visibility, or Black visibility is not Black power. And too often Black Studies becomes a champion for the symbolic inclusion or advance of an individual Black person, athlete, politician, et cetera. So that's what I wanted to be producing more within Black and other communities, conversations around socialism, communism, Pan-Africanism, African nationalism. Black studies should be, I would think, part of this country's intellectual support system for the uprisings in the Sahel in West Africa right now, or wherever else. That's what and for too many of us, and I would, even for me, though I'm at the lower end of it, it's become too much of a comfort producing career. And I don't think that is what Black Studies was supposed to be, producing just careers and careerists. But, Dr. Turner, I keep saying, I mentioned him a lot today, but, he used to say, he once asked us a question, he said he thought that his generation got wrong the rejection entirely of a pursuit of money, not because they wanted to be Black capitalists or anything like that, but because he thought, for the purpose of practicality maybe and practice. But he would say the question isn't can you earn 100,000? The question is can you live off of 30? Mm-hmm. And I always think about that and I think too many of us have said, yeah, I can live off of 100 and I'm, try to make 2 as opposed to that, live off the 30 part. And I think that's become too much of a metaphor for what has happened with Black studies. And I'm concerned about that going forward because as my sort of other field of interest for me has also encouraged the production of counterinsurgency, psychological warfare, and symbol manipulation is only getting better. Mm-hmm. And to the extent we're losing the ability to radically critique that environment from the perspective of the African world, we are in big trouble. And, but that's, yeah, so I am concerned. I am worried.
Yeah, no, I'm moved by that. That was very thoughtful. Thank you. I mean, and the success of Black studies is both what it's done well and not done well. I mean, you really laid it out really clearly there and put it right in front of us, this crisis of January 2025, right? I mean, this will be live in February, but this moment in early 2025, this question of the movement of symbols that structure our world. What does it mean for Black studies to not be an intervening force in that? I'm going to take that away from this. I hope other people listening really do, because taking that seriously is it's deeply troubling and frustrating and despairing, but it's also, like all those things, also flips to a sense of imperative and hopefully commitment. So I appreciate that. And maybe then this is already an answer to my last question, but I wanted to ask you in a Black studies context, what do you think is a question that's most urgent? What is the issue that you think is most urgent that we should all be thinking about? We should all be asking about?
So again, well, similar to what I was just saying, I think really the bigger questions for me are that I do literally think about at least every semester because of the nature of my courses and my particular interest, but is kind of what I was alluding to. How do we maintain a focus on revolutionary traditions? Not expanding by loosening and weakening the definition, but expanding the Black radical tradition in terms of conveying it without and dealing with some of the disagreements. We talked a little bit off air about some, what I perceive as a problem of disagreement being taken automatically as animosity, as opposed to people trying to work things out. So that's really it. How do we maintain a focus on revolutionary traditions, expanding Black radical tradition without, devolving into the internecine battles and ego stuff that goes on? Selfishly, for me, the big question is, how do we stop what I think is a rising tide again of Black capitalism? And this idea that we can Black entrepreneur ourselves to freedom. That is the logic of that is from my sort of myopic focus is sort of taking over, both in terms of what's being written popularly, some scholarship, and taking place in the media, our media environment. There's just too much Black capitalism. So, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I mean, that's, look, this has been a fantastic conversation, Jared. I really appreciate your time and thoughtfulness. And there's like really a lot here to think about. And I think that you've underscored a lot of things that will trouble in the best way all of us listening. I mean, me listening to you talk in this. Trouble in that sense of like, what am I doing? Right? At this basic level in Black studies, what does it mean to care about the field and to care about the liberation of Black people? I just think you put it really well in this conversation and in multiple kinds of ways and multiple ways of connecting to it. And I'm really thankful for that. This is a fantastic contribution to the series. So I appreciate you.
No, thank you. As I said before, I'm a fan of the podcast. It's an honor to have been invited, and I think what you and Ashley have put together here is very important. So thank you for the invitation, and continued good work.
Well, we'll continue the conversation too. So thank you so much. I appreciate it, and have a great rest of your day.
Likewise.
Bye-bye.